The following program, The Russ Belville Show, is intended for responsible adults only. We advocate to the repeal of marijuana prohibition for adults. We discuss the science, culture, and controversy about America's marijuana laws. We do not advocate any illegal activity and encourage all listeners to learn their state and federal marijuana laws. Opinions and claims made by guests and advertisers on The Russ Belville Show are their own, and The Russ Belville Show cannot be held legally responsible for their validity or reliability. Viewer discretion is advised.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the continent to bring you the truth about cannabis and marijuana law reform.
I smoke pot and I like it a lot.
From the promise of legalization.
And I think that we need to rethink and decriminalize our laws.
To the agony of prohibition.
One major responsibility is to encourage people to use less drugs.
The Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation.
Yeah, I hear you had a question for me.
Now, here's your host, Radical Russ Belville.
Good day, tokers and tokettes, and welcome to the show. It is Tuesday, January 14th, 2014, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world. It's also got to be time for a very special edition of the Russ Belville Show today. My good friend, my one non-pot smoking friend, Kevin Sabet, that's right, Kevin Sabet from Project Sam, is here in the state of Oregon. He's testifying today in front of a whole bunch of cops. They're having some sort of law enforcement gathering, and he's speaking at that gathering just today, I believe. And on Friday, he'll be down in Salem, Oregon at our Statehouse, testifying in front of a House committee to try to convince them to not legalize marijuana. Well, you know, I got something to say about that. In fact, I got so much to say about it that I've put together a slideshow of testimony that I will be sending to the committee members in the legislature and sending along copies with some of my friends in activism to be there in Salem on Friday. And today, I am going to deliver that PowerPoint presentation to you in full throughout the rest of this hour. So our regular news and music and all of that will be suspended for the day. Sorry, Electric Bob, I know if you're listening out there, no music for the day because we've got nothing but Sabet bashing for today's show. So make sure you stick around for that. And then in hour two, we'll get to some of our regular topics. So stick around. We got plenty of Reefer Madness coming up and all the facts, charts, data, reason, science, logic, and sound bites you need to defeat Kevin Sabet when he comes to your town. This is also available for download at our 420 radio shop if you'd like a copy for yourself. Stick around. The Sabet bashing is next.
We'll be right back after these messages from our 420 friendly sponsors. Support these advertisers because their ad money goes straight to the Russ Belville Show. You're tuned into the Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation.
I'm Radical Russ Belville, and I want to thank you for listening to 420 Radio. We couldn't survive without you and our sponsors, and I'd like you to check out one of our prime sponsors, the National Cannabis Coalition. I've been working with NCC since June of 2012, and I'm proud to be part of the team they have assembled. National Cannabis Coalition is building the partnerships with reformers, lawmakers, and industry we need to be successful. Visit the National Cannabis Coalition website at nationalcannabiscoalition.com or the easier-to-remember ncc420.com. That's where you'll get the exclusive first look at my radical rants, as well as informative articles from the nation's top cannabis pundits. Visit ncc420.com today, and if you have your phone handy, text Russ to 420-420 to support NCC and 420 Radio. It's a free text message that helps us help you end adult marijuana prohibition. Learn more at ncc420.com, and thanks for supporting independent marijuana legalization public radio. 420 Radio, your ticket to the Boston Freedom Rally. The law offices of Omar Figueroa would like to remind you to stand up for your rights. Please do not give up your precious liberties. There's nothing wrong with standing up for our constitutional rights, and in fact, it's the best way to honor the Constitution that recognizes our natural rights. Treat law enforcement with respect and respect the Constitution by standing up for your rights. If you are detained or arrested, stand up for your rights by repeating, "I respectfully invoke all of my legal and constitutional rights. I do not consent to any search and seizure. I want to remain silent, and I want to speak with my attorney, Omar Figueroa." Omar Figueroa has more than a decade of experience in federal and California courts and graduated from Yale University, Stanford Law School, and Trial Lawyers College. Please contact the law offices of Omar Figueroa at 415-489-0420 or 707-829-0215 or on the web at omarfigueroa.com. This is your 420 Radio News special for Tuesday, January 14th, 2014. Testimony to the Oregon legislature against Kevin Sabet, Ph.D. All right, so this presentation is known as a rebuttal to Kevin Sabet, Ph.D., analysis and rebuttal for the third way, kinder, gentler drug war strategies advocated by Kevin Sabet and Project SAM. Today's presentation is a critical analysis of the testimony that Kevin Sabet will likely be offering in opposition to Oregon's medical marijuana program and its plans to legalize recreational marijuana. My bias is clear. I believe marijuana is here to stay, and it is better if the state regulates the industry than to allow the status quo of criminal control of cannabis markets. Mr. Sabet will attempt to confuse and distract the legislature from the benefits to be gained through legalization by inventing harms where there are none and exaggerating the few harms that exist. I hope this analysis will provide the legislature with critical questions to ask of Mr. Sabet. Kevin Sabet I met him 1 year ago in Houston, Texas, as we faced off in a marijuana legalization debate at the Baker Institute. He has been the right-hand man to drug czar Gil Kurlikowski from 2009 to 2011. Currently, he is the director of the Drug Policy Institute at the University of Florida. He has dedicated his doctoral thesis and entire career to shaping the debate on drug policy to maintain drug prohibition. He has smartly crafted a message that appears to take the middle ground on the issue of marijuana. He will readily admit that the war on drugs has led to rampant incarceration, racist enforcement, and not reduced the consumption of drugs one iota, thus avoiding the appearance of a drug warrior. But then he'll pivot to claiming the legalization of marijuana is as equally untenable as the war on drugs, hoping to convince listeners that we can end the worst aspects of the drug war without ending its primary function, arresting people who grow, sell, and use marijuana. Just 7% of the American public believes we're winning the war on drugs. A majority, 58%, believe we should legalize marijuana, and a supermajority, 84%, believe at most someone involved with marijuana should be ticketed and fined, not arrested and jailed. Facing such public relations obstacles, Kevin Sabet has rebranded the searching, arresting, and punishing of individuals who use marijuana as doing so for their own good and the good of society. I call this the kinder, gentler drug war, and it seeks to funnel the pipeline of marijuana users who are caught to expensive mandatory drug rehabilitation they neither want nor need.
That means we would reject either extreme dichotomy, and that's what Project SAM is about. On the one hand, old policies of incarceration and prohibition, but on the other hand, what is sort of being rebranded as new, but is not new, legalization.
This is a straw man dichotomy that is being set up by Kevin Sabet. The idea is to present our argument in a false manner in order to make it easy to defeat. He's claiming that we're arguing another type of fallacy called a false dichotomy, an argument where only two either-or choices are given when there are more than two choices. Kevin knows only 7% of the public believes we're winning the war on drugs, so he demonizes that and legalization in the same argument. Then Project SAM can ride in like the cavalry with reasonable middle ground solutions, allowing people who are turned off by the drug war but wary of legalization a campaign to rally around. But the fact remains that Kevin Sabet would still use cops and courts to process marijuana users into expensive rehabs, some that might be paid by the Oregon Health Plan, and he would change nothing about the arrest and incarceration of marijuana growers and sellers. The taxing of marijuana has become one of the most popular reasons why people who don't smoke marijuana support legalizing it. Kevin Sabet needs to paint that tax revenue as a false hope. He wants to confuse the listener by conflating the costs of legal alcohol and tobacco with legal marijuana. If you're not paying attention to how much marijuana prohibition is costing us, you might be convinced that we can't afford to legalize marijuana. This is a little shell game I like to call the Sabet conjecture, the idea that we'd all be better off not making any tax revenue off of marijuana sales.
For every dollar we get on alcohol and tobacco tax in this country, we spend $10 in lost social costs. So people that look at this know this is actually a loss leader.
This is a logical fallacy of the false analogy. It's like saying football and boxing lead to head trauma, so we must ban golfing. The idea is that legal alcohol and legal tobacco only bring in 1/10 in taxes what they cost society in social costs. Therefore, legalizing marijuana would turn out the same way. However, this ignores three facts. Alcohol leads to violence, car wrecks, and cirrhosis. Tobacco leads to lung cancer, emphysema, and illness. And marijuana leads to jazz, donuts, and a nap. Number two, marijuana already exists. Marijuana legalization doesn't suddenly create costs from marijuana that we aren't already paying while bringing in no tax revenue at all. And number three, we're spending tax money trying in vain to stop it. How much more social costs would we suffer if alcohol and tobacco were prohibited? And in a state like Oregon with no sales tax and public reticence to raising existing taxes, wouldn't a marijuana tax be a welcome thing? The quick debunk of the Sabet conjecture is to simply say, yes, alcohol and tobacco cost more because they are toxic and addictive. Whatever marijuana costs, we're paying that now and bringing in zero tax money and spending billions trying to stop it. For backup, you can turn to this study from the Center for Addictions Research in British Columbia. They found in 2002 that one tobacco smoker cost Canada $822 per year in healthcare costs. An alcohol drinker cost $165. A pot smoker cost $20. Meanwhile, Canada spends $328 per pot smoker on prohibition enforcement. So sure, alcohol and tobacco bring in less money than they cost, but a drinker costs 8 times more, and a smoker costs 40 times more than what a pot smoker costs. Certainly, we can find a way to make $20 in taxes a year off of a pot smoker.
The lottery, we've heard about it for gambling, we've heard about it for tobacco, we've heard about it for alcohol.
This is a strange distraction that Kevin Sabet has offered lately to complain that campaigners promised big tax revenues for schools with the passage of state lotteries. But digging a little into these complaints finds that they concern the distribution of lottery proceeds, not that the lottery wasn't bringing the state any tax money. One might ask Kevin Sabet if he preferred we return to the era of running the numbers, where teens earn $1 or $2 collecting lottery bets for the rackets run by the mob, or if we're better off with state lotteries that are well run and put some money back into help for problem gamblers. Another tactic used by the kinder, gentler drug warriors is guilt by association. The idea of taxing marijuana has become popular as states are struggling to balance budgets. The prohibitionists want the people to think the cost of these tax revenues will be too great to bear. By bringing up the specter of big tobacco, prohibitionists have a frame to play in where the tax revenue we receive from tobacco costs us in addiction and death, allowed an industry to lie for decades about the harmfulness of its products, and created a market that preys on children. Then, the fear of big tobacco can be transferred onto a straw man of big marijuana to fear.
It's already in 18 states. It's going even further. And before we know it, we're going to wake up one day and we're going to have another tobacco industry. It's going to be called the marijuana industry. We already know what big tobacco did to our kids. Joe Camel targeting kids.
Have you seen this camel? Joseph, or Joe Camel, is a 6'2" brown-haired anthropomorphic dromedary, last seen wearing Tom Cruise's sunglasses and Don Johnson's Miami Vice wardrobe. He has been missing since 1998. along with his associate, the Marlboro Man. He used to be found hanging out at the NASCAR Winston Cup Racing Series and was last seen in magazine and television advertisements in the 20th century.
Let's look at our cigarette policy over the last 80 years and not forget what happened. We had big tobacco, peddling tobacco, saying, first of all, it's medicine. You know, in the 50s, tobacco was medicine. It's pretty interesting now with marijuana. They downplayed the harms to kids. They actually make money off of addiction. That is no model for marijuana.
This is another example of the false analogy that big marijuana would be just like big tobacco. We can agree to some of the harms we saw from big tobacco, like marketing to kids, and point out how that makes a perfect guidebook for what not to do as we legalize marijuana. Then point out that big tobacco had to lie about its product because its product is toxic and addictive. This would also be the time to point out that in 2006, Dr. Donald Tashkin, working for the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, studied marijuana smoking over 30 years of use to find a link to lung cancer, and not only did not find a link, but found that pot smokers had less incidence of head, neck, and lung cancer. Since we learned all those lessons from 80 years of big tobacco, why wouldn't we strictly regulate marijuana marketing from the start of the industry?
I think it'll be a mess with our First Amendment to allow marijuana legalization. We didn't have a First Amendment, we could maybe talk.
In 1965, the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act required warning labels on cigarette packs. In 1967, the FCC required TV stations to run anti-smoking spots for free. In 1970, the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act banned the advertising of cigarettes on television and radio and added warnings to print ads. In 1984, the Comprehensive Smoking Education Act mandated more warnings on all advertisements. In 1997, we sued Big Tobacco, and from that, the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement banned outdoor, billboard, and public transportation advertising of cigarettes in 46 states. It also prohibits tobacco advertising that targets young people, the usage of cartoons, such as the Marlboro Man or Joe Camel in particular. And in 2010, the Tobacco Control Act required all audio and video ads to contain no music, no sound effects, no images, and no color. Yet, we still have a First Amendment, and all those acts are constitutional. Big Tobacco doesn't tell us what big marijuana will be, but we can take a look at what big marijuana is like right now. We can have a big marijuana that, like big tobacco, pays taxes, creates jobs, and settles its disputes in courtrooms with lawyers. Or we can keep the current big marijuana that launders money, corrupts police, and settles its disputes with plata o plomo, a bribe or a bullet. The marijuana market is never going away, and Kevin Sabet's Project Sam proposals do nothing to address the market, leaving it to the murderous Mexican terrorists who traffic marijuana, the underground domestic growers who don't pay taxes and sully state forest lands, and the teenage marijuana dealers who take the best paying job on the streets.
15% of cartels, according to Rand, 15 to 20% get it from marijuana. Right. Big enough chunk to worry about? Yeah, right. Big enough chunk to worry about, not the vast majority. If you're worried about organized crime, though, the answer is not in marijuana. That's just not where the action is. It's in the other drugs.
Sure, most pot smokers buy small amounts from friends. But as a friend of mine once noted, small amounts come from large amounts, and large amounts come from large grows, and that's what supports 15 to 26%, the actual Rand estimate, of the cartel's income. The question isn't whether making marijuana markets legal ends organized crime. It's why are we allowing organized crime to run our marijuana markets? One way of confusing the debate about marijuana legalization is to frame it as if we are offering people a new choice on the menu of recreational substances. Given that we have two choices already, alcohol and tobacco, and we have so many demonstrable harms from those, why should we offer people another harmful choice on the menu? This way, the harms from alcohol and tobacco that arise from their pharmacology, the fact that they are toxic and addictive, can be attributed to their legality, making it seem as if legality is what would bring further harm from marijuana.
We already have enough problems with our two legal drugs, alcohol and tobacco. They're widely promoted by an industry that lives off of other people's addiction. They're widely normalized, advertised. I don't think we need another problem in society, and marijuana would do that.
Newsflash, marijuana is here. First of all, there aren't just two legal recreational substances. Caffeine is a substance we enjoy in coffee and soda. Sugar is a substance we enjoy in candy and soda. If you don't think those are mind-altering and mood-altering drugs, let me give your 5-year-old a Mountain Dew while we discuss it. While you can be quite addicted to those substances, and they do cause healthcare costs to our society, nobody's considering locking people up who drink Mountain Dew. Second, we're not talking about introducing a brand new drug that nobody's ever seen before. Marijuana's here and 26 million people are using it. The only question is who controls and benefits from the market, criminals or taxpayers?
We see prescription drugs today are legal and they're available. Alcohol is legal, available, and so is tobacco. And we're doing a pretty bad job of preventing and treating those 3 legal drugs.
An interesting bit of framing by Project Sam is to paint legalization as a hopeless option. Sabet will point out either the poor job we're doing controlling alcohol, since there's so many drunk drivers and other costs, or the poor job we do controlling OxyContin or other prescription drugs, since there is now an epidemic of prescription drug abuse. For this, fall back to the point that those drugs are incredibly addictive and have massive withdrawal effects. Comparing marijuana to OxyContin is like comparing apples to, well, OxyContin.
More people are arrested for alcohol offenses every year than all drugs combined because more people use alcohol and it's much more prevalent.
Lately, Kevin Sabet has been confusing people by pointing out how many more arrests there are for alcohol violations. This is a continuation of the hopeless option false analogy, the idea being that legal marijuana wouldn't save any law enforcement money because there'd be more arrests for legal marijuana than prohibited marijuana. Of course, for this to be effective, you must ignore that many alcohol arrests are for actual crimes like DUI or assault that are caused by alcohol and would exist even under prohibition. And other arrests are for violations like underage possession or selling to minors that are the whole reason for having regulations in the first place.
27% of Americans still smoke. 1 out of 4 Americans. Over 55% of Americans drink. How many people smoke marijuana? Our household surveys say about 8% of people are regular users. So, something about illegality does drive use down.
This is the logical fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc, meaning, since this happened, then that happened, this caused that. The fact that alcohol and tobacco are popular and legal does not mean they are popular because they are legal. The fact that marijuana isn't as popular isn't because it is prohibited. For example, it's more prohibited than cocaine and meth, but far more people smoke pot. Again, remember that alcohol and tobacco are highly addictive. That's part of the reason so many use those. Marijuana use has become more popular over the past 4 decades, even though it's illegal. And whether there are more marijuana smokers after legalization is irrelevant without considering how many of them are choosing marijuana over alcohol or prescription medications and how much net good that will accomplish.
So this notion that we're going to give the green light of permissibility for people to think, oh, it's harmless, go ahead and experiment. Now, we know kids have access to this anyway, but we shouldn't be adding fuel to the fire.
Cigarette smoking may be the greatest example of the use of strict regulations, public education, and social pressure to reduce the harms from drug use. An activity that used to be commonplace in restaurants, boardrooms, and airplanes is now one that is prohibited nearly everywhere indoors and relegated to special zones outdoors. Cigarettes that used to be easy for kids to buy or steal are now placed behind locked counters where adult cashiers consistently check for proper ID. The glamour and cool of the cigarette smoker has been replaced with public service campaigns that portray the shocking health effects from smoking. This has been successful despite nicotine being one of the most addictive drugs, despite the fact it's sold by massively profitable corporations, and despite the fact that it's available to people at age 18 in most states. So much so that today, more high school seniors have tried smoking marijuana than have tried smoking tobacco.
We know that when drugs are legal, they're cheaper, they're more available, than they're promoted.
Since 1981, the price it costs for a pure gram of heroin, adjusted for inflation, has dropped over 80%. The price of cocaine has dropped 80%, and crack cocaine has dropped 60%. Since the government started tracking meth in 1986, its price has dropped almost 60%. The only drug that got more expensive over 3 decades of prohibition was marijuana, which increased over 80% in price. And drugs are more potent now. Cocaine and meth are more pure, heroin's more than tripled in purity, and marijuana potency has more than doubled. A year ago, I debated Kevin Sabet, and during my presentation, I paraphrased the fear-mongering about the new, supposedly genetically modified, hyper-potent skunk we grow in the Pacific Northwest these days, with the catchphrase, "This is not your father's Woodstock weed." Unfortunately, Kevin Sabet has latched onto that and is using it to frighten the baby boom generation, so their positive experiences with marijuana won't apply to this new, super-potent marijuana.
I mean, we know that today's marijuana is not your marijuana of the Woodstock days of what people might have smoked in their dorms pretty harmlessly in the 60s or 70s. It's 5 to 7 times more potent.
This is Kevin Sabet's own PowerPoint slide from a presentation he gave a few years ago. It shows the average potency in seized marijuana from 1983, where it was around 4%, to 2009, where it was around 10%. That's over 2 times more potent, but not 5 to 7 times more potent. By his measure, we're supposed to believe they were smoking 1.4% to 2% ditchweed at Woodstock. I've seen the Woodstock movie, and I find that very hard to believe. The reason why the Woodstock weed argument affects people is they analogize alcohol with marijuana. They understand the difference between low-potency beer and high-potency shots, and they know that a quart of beer will get you drunk, but a quart of Jack Daniels could kill you. So pot smokers of the past who fondly remember pot, but haven't used lately, might be scared into thinking today's pot is somehow different. Point out that there has always been Sinsemilla, Acapulco Gold, Maui Wowie, Panama Red, etc. And the difference is with Woodstock weed, you used to smoke 2 or 3 joints to get high. Today you smoke 2 or 3 puffs to get high. That means less harmful smoke, but no different high. One of the only points the drug warriors have left that resonates with the public is called "What About the Children?" or WOTC. Nobody wants kids smoking pot, even we agree to that. With WOTC, we need to show how maintaining marijuana prohibition is what truly puts the children at risk, and legalization is what will protect them.
We know that 1 out of every 6 kids that try marijuana will become addicted to it, okay? That's not 6 out of 6, but that's probably something and plenty to worry about.
This is one of Kevin's latest sound bites, and it requires careful debunking. Indeed, some teens who get heavily into marijuana experience dependence issues. But that is the case now under prohibition. I'd like to ask, should we return to alcohol prohibition because some kids turn out to be alcoholics? Then the pivot. If marijuana is something we want to keep from kids, shouldn't we put it in adults-only stores and check kids for ID? As it is today, under prohibition, 4.4 million kids have tried pot, and 44% of them know a drug dealer at school who very rarely offers cigarettes and alcohol, because there's little profit in them and they're harder to get. Large majority of kids, when surveyed, express how easy or fairly easy it is to buy pot, and much easier than buying cigarettes or tobacco, or alcohol or tobacco, excuse me. Kevin Sabet will respond to this with figures about how many kids can more easily access alcohol and tobacco by theft, adult straw purchasers, and fake IDs than they can marijuana, but he will never suggest that prohibition of booze and smokes should be the answer to that, instead of better security, punishing adults who furnish kids with booze and smokes, and awareness campaigns for parents. When I was in high school in the 80s, over 90% of high school seniors had taken an alcoholic drink in their lifetime. That's the top blue line. Over 70% of my peers had smoked a cigarette, the middle red line. And even though I wasn't one of them, over half of my classmates had tried smoking pot, the middle light green line. Now, after 20 states have passed medical marijuana and 2 states have legalized, far fewer kids do any of those drugs. Lifetime drinking has dropped from a high of 93.4% down to just 70%, partially thanks to a 21 drinking age and stricter carding. Lifetime tobacco use has dropped from a max of 75.8% to an all-time low of 40%, partially thanks to killing Joe Camel and making smokes harder to access. And marijuana use is lower now at 45% than the high of 60.4% in 1979 or the modern high of 49.6% when California passed medical marijuana. And monthly 12th grade use of marijuana, the bottom dark green line, has remained between 18 and 23% for the entire medical marijuana era.
I get that only 1 out of 6 kids who try pot will become addicted to it, okay? I get that 5 out of 6 actually won't have that many problems. But I'm very concerned about that 1 out of 6 because they cause the problems, they cause the social costs, they cause the IQ drop, they cause the car crashes. And so our policies, I think, should be focused on that 1 out of 6 that can't handle it.
One way to puncture any marijuana policy argument is to repeat it with alcohol in place of marijuana. I get that kids who try alcohol have a 4 times greater risk of becoming alcoholics, okay? I get that most kids who drink won't become alcoholics. But I'm very concerned about the 15% of people who become alcoholics because they cause the problems, they cause the social costs, they get into fights, they cause the drunk driving. And so, we should arrest and force them into treatment? We should force any adult into treatment that we catch with a beer?
Heavy persistent use leads to significant IQ loss among young people.
Yes.
But in Oregon, where there's medical marijuana...
Sorry?
Heavy persistent use leads to significant IQ loss among young people.
This is a recent study that has been heavily criticized, but never mind that. It's not our job to argue that marijuana use is safe, especially for kids. We're not arguing about legalizing marijuana use for kids. We're talking about putting marijuana in adults-only stores and checking kids for ID. Whatever harms there may be for kids using marijuana exist now under prohibition, and Kevin Sabet argues for maintaining that criminal prohibition for adults.
But in Oregon, where there's medical marijuana, kids can get a license.
Here are some videos of 7-year-old, at the time, Michaela Comstock from my show. She is battling leukemia and uses medical cannabis oil capsules to deal with the nausea and pain. An hour earlier, she had a chemotherapy session. During the interview, she is munching down on some French fries.
My favorite food is apples and bananas.
Oh. You know, there's a song about apples and bananas. Have you ever sang that song?
No.
Yeah, okay, well maybe...
But I made a little one up. Apples and bananas, apples and bananas, apples and bananas, apples and bananas. Apples are my favorite, apples are my favorite, and so are bananas, 'cause bananas are great for you.
So, you know, this is kind of, you know, one of the things about using cannabis as a medicine is that it scares some people. They're kind of afraid of it. And so what would you tell them as far as, you know...
Don't be afraid.
Yeah? How come?
Because it helps other people that use it, and it helps me a lot.
Helps. And then this is a video of another 11-year-old, Alex Eccles, and his dad, Jeremy. Alex suffers from autism and sometimes seizures of rage that make him pound his head into walls and bite and scratch himself bloody. Jeremy has found some success in giving Alex a cannabis oil that leaves him relaxed and curious, but cannot get him consistent supply or dose him at the group home.
And then we started figuring out that we were running out, and we realized we don't know anybody who has ever talked to us about pot. We just weren't those people. We were never involved in the underground. Yeah.
Like that. Okay.
So, I started talking to people that I worked with and found out, to my surprise, that basically every one of them was at least acquainted with marijuana at some point.
You were the one guy who wasn't.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic. So
and these are software engineers. These are smart people, and I was just blown away. I was like, smart people, and you guys use this stuff recreationally? It definitely turned around my perceptions.
What about the children indeed? This is one of the most powerful frames our opponents can use because it activates a natural instinct to protect our young that overrides rational higher thought processes. Keep reminding the listeners that any harms they are conjuring about children and marijuana exist now because of the marijuana prohibition. You don't see any high school tequila dealers, and kids don't make much money selling cigarettes. If WOTC is the most powerful weapon in the drug war propaganda playbook, then SMOF is number 2, which stands for Stoned Mayhem on the Freeways. Now, we're empathetic to the goal of safer roads, and we don't claim there is absolutely no risk from cannabis-impaired drivers. What we do admit is acute cannabis impairment, not the presence of metabolites in urine or THC in blood, is a risk, but one that is less troublesome than drinking or smartphone use.
The British Medical Journal told us a few months ago that their most comprehensive study they've ever done showed that marijuana intoxication doubles your car crash risk.
Nobody is arguing for the right to pull bong rips and then get behind the wheel. Of course, marijuana-impaired driving should remain illegal. Once again, Sabet's fear-mongering is only scary if you forget that marijuana exists now and any driving risks exist now. With illegal marijuana, there are no friends don't let friends drive stoned ads. There is no modeling for responsible use. As for that British Medical Journal study, it mentions that alcohol drivers are a much greater crash risk than cannabis drivers. It also is the kind of study called a meta-analysis that synthesizes many other previous studies that are wildly inconsistent with one another and ignore potential confounders, like the fact pot smokers tend to be young males who also tend to have the greatest crash risks. In 2013, a study published in the Journal of Accident Analysis and Prevention found that among all drugs, legal and illegal, marijuana had the least odds risk for an accident. This study compared all alcohol drivers, not just the 0.08 blood alcohol drivers from the British Medical Journal study. Dr. Guoha Li, lead author of the study, said, quote, "I would say even though there are risks associated with the use of marijuana, it seems to be not as big as other drugs like depressants, stimulants, and other narcotics." While SMOF conjures up roadways littered with the wrecks of pot-smoking drivers, in truth, our roadways have never been safer. In 1994, over 1.7 people died in crashes per every 100 million miles driven in the United States. In 2011, that number was 1.1, a drop of 36%. Fatal crashes in Colorado and Washington have declined 45% and 41% respectively. Oregon has seen fatalities fall from 1.91 in 1995 to 0.99 in 2011, a drop of 48%. Correlation is not causation. Cars have become safer, for instance. But if the rapid spread of medical marijuana since 1996 has caused a greater chance of accidents, we're not seeing that reflected in the national traffic statistics. We must also emphasize that marijuana users, unlike alcohol drinkers, can judge their relative impairment. This is a fact the government implicitly accepts in their warnings on a bottle of dronabinol pills. Those are the Schedule III legal version of THC in a pill called Marinol. The warning reads in part, quote, "Patients receiving treatment with Marinol capsules should be specifically warned not to drive until it is established that they are able to tolerate the drug and perform such tasks safely." Most of the public, at least 4 out of 5, believe that if there's going to be any punishment for marijuana, it should be a ticket and a fine, not jail time. The message of wasting police resources on busting pot smokers is very damaging to prohibition. The prohibitionists now must distance themselves from the lock 'em up, tough on crime, war on drugs frames that they've been working in for 40 years. They'll do so by minimizing the impact of marijuana arrests and cherry-picking incarceration statistics. Where they can't minimize, specifically the racism of drug arrests, they will attempt to distract and evade. According to the 2014 CNN opinion poll, 55% of Americans believe marijuana should be legal, with support at 58% in the West. Previous state surveys of Oregon have put support at over 60%. And even in the absence of legalization, Americans by a margin of 17 out of 20 believe jail should not be the punishment for marijuana smoking. Kevin Sabet will try to minimize the public support for marijuana legalization by claiming that he too doesn't support incarceration for marijuana, but that the polls aren't asking Americans what they think about the sales of marijuana. Well, this same CNN poll found 55% support for legalization and 54% support for sales.
Yeah, we're not jailing
let's show a map
marijuana
here because
users.
we have
Sure.
18 states.
We're not jailing marijuana users. Here are a couple of examples from Kevin's PowerPoint presentation that illustrate this strategy of minimizing marijuana arrests. I've added the bullet points in red. In this example, he explains how very few people are in state prison only for marijuana possession. But 0.7% of the state prison population of 1.3 million works out to 9,177 people doing time for marijuana possession alone. Additionally, according to the Human Solution, an advocacy group, 25 Americans are serving life behind bars for sales activities that are now legal in Colorado and Washington. Naturally, Sabet's statistic is only telling half the truth. Indeed, very few people are coded into the Bureau of Justice Statistics as being in prison for marijuana possession alone, because many people who are caught possessing marijuana are sentenced under another statute that punishes possession in certain circumstances more strictly. For example, if you're on probation for a stick-up robbery from 2002 and you're caught with a joint, you're sent back to prison under that robbery charge, not the pot charge. This list is also useful when Kevin attempts to minimize the few in prison by saying they've pleaded down from more serious crimes. Yes, more serious crimes like growing or selling marijuana.
The war on drugs is a horrible analogy. It's actually an analogy the government hasn't used for years.
Right. The tactics have remained the same. We just don't call it a war on drugs anymore.
Well, actually, there has been a recent shift over the last few years to a public health balanced approach.
This is a comparison of the drug war budgets during the last term of George W. Bush and the first term of Barack Obama. In the red bars, we have the funding for treatment and prevention, and in the blue, we have law enforcement, interdiction, and international. Comparing terms, Obama has increased drug war funding by $11 billion and maintained a 3-to-2 tilt in favor of law enforcement over treatment. There is no shift.
It's no accident that the liquor lobby and the liquor industry targets minorities in disadvantaged neighborhoods. There are 3 to 4 times more liquor stores in those neighborhoods than in upper-class white neighborhoods. That's going to happen with marijuana.
Again, why wouldn't we learn that lesson and apply zoning restrictions before we fill up the hood with pot shops? And you just have to lose all mooring with reality to think the black community wouldn't rather have well-regulated weed stores on the corner than gun-toting weed dealers on the corner, and 1 out of 3 young black men in America under correctional control. Now the drug warriors are in a strange predicament, where they must minimize the notion that we do jail people for pot, but at the same time show that the threat of jailing people for pot is a good thing to force them to accept rehab as the alternative. The key to unraveling this talking point is to demolish their implicit assumption that all use of marijuana is abuse, and all abusers are sick people who need treatment.
Things like drug courts, which actually use the power of the criminal justice system to get people to treatment, and if they successfully complete treatment, they don't end up going to jail or having a criminal record.
Kevin Sabet's goal is to pivot from a punitive incarceration for marijuana, which is increasingly unpopular, to a drug court model that diverts marijuana smokers to drug rehab with the threat of punitive incarceration if they relapse. Marijuana arrests and rehab admissions have increased along with the implementation of drug courts. Rehabs are less expensive than housing prisoners, and placing a lot of marijuana smokers there who don't have addiction problems, as most don't, boosts the success rate statistics of these rehabs in courts. It's amazing how effective your rehab programs are at stopping pot smokers if you give them the constant urine tests and threat of jail.
That doesn't mean that we can't reform our current marijuana laws, make sure people with small amounts of possession on their record, for example, are not stigmatized, make sure they can get a job in the future so they can actually exit the illicit economy, give them a lot of opportunities.
Most people who are busted for marijuana aren't benefiting from the illicit economy. 88% of all marijuana arrests are for possession. The 12% engaged in the illicit economy benefit greatly from the profit and prohibition, which will still be there whether the buyers get rehab or jail. According to the government's treatment episode data set for admissions, marijuana users make up 1 out of every 5 people in rehab who are admitted for marijuana as a primary or secondary substance. Over half of the people admitted to rehab for pot use it less than once a week, and over a third didn't use marijuana for over a month before rehab. That means at least 1 out of 10 people in rehab for drugs are there for marijuana they hardly smoke. It seems clear that legalized marijuana will reduce the number of people forced into rehab against their will, thus reducing the profits of Kevin Sabet's supporters and financiers in the drug testing and rehab industries.
I'm not saying we need to arrest and jail marijuana users for long amounts of time, but having some kind of stigma on the actual use itself while also getting treatment and intervening on early use.
Again, according to the treatment episode data set for admissions, only 13% of the people who are in drug rehab for marijuana alone admitted themselves to rehab. Almost 3 in 5 in rehab for pot are forced there by the criminal justice system. People who are in rehab for alcohol are twice as likely to self-admit. People using other drugs are more than 3 times as likely to self-admit. And less than 1 in 4 for other drugs are forced into rehab by the criminal justice system. California's passage of Prop 215 in 1996 and the subsequent passage of medical marijuana laws in 20 other states and D.C. is a big hurdle. But now that Colorado and Washington have legalized marijuana, Kevin Sabet must cherry-pick data to paint their laws as disasters. This must be exceptionally difficult when TV shows lines of people waiting patiently as the snow falls in Denver to peacefully buy some marijuana in a safe professional store. Kevin Sabet has to show how $5 million in the first week of sales in Colorado isn't worth taxing in Oregon. A report by the Washington State Patrol got a lot of press last month when it showed 745 positive THC tests of drivers in the first 6 months, compared to an average of 1,000 per year for the past 3 years. This fails to account for the fact that the I-502 legalization law created an unscientific per se DUID limit of 5 nanograms of active THC per milliliter of blood, thus providing Washington State Patrol a definable target for increasing DUI arrest totals. Washington State Patrol is now ordering blood tests in suspected DUI cases where they hadn't before. This is borne out by the fact that Washington State Patrol is not stopping more people for suspicion of impaired driving, still averaging about 20,000 stops a year. So the patrol isn't witnessing more impaired driving. And as we saw earlier, driving fatalities are falling at a greater rate in medical marijuana states than non-medical marijuana states. Washington's Target Zero program shows that there were 301 impaired driving fatalities in 2006. By 2011, after much greater liberalization of medical marijuana in Washington, there were just 199, a reduction of 50%. Washington State Patrol's figures for the first half of 2013 have the state on pace for only 80 impairment fatalities, a reduction of over 100% from just 2 years ago. A similar tactic is used to demonize Washington and Colorado, where the states have participated in national DUI crackdowns from the middle of August through Labor Day weekend, as they have done in years prior. In Washington state, Kitsap County, due west of Seattle and including the city of Bremerton, just 47 people were pulled over for impaired on anything driving, when 71 had been pulled over the year prior. In King County, which includes Seattle, impaired driving stops dropped from 374 last year to 292. That DUI crackdown also began on the weekend of the first Seattle Hemp Fest to occur after marijuana had been legalized. In Colorado, some counties and cities broke their data down by impairing substance. In Jefferson County, there were 6 DUI arrests, 1 was for marijuana. In Arapahoe County, out of 17 DUI arrests, 2 were for marijuana. In Adams County, just 1 out of 38 DUI arrests were for marijuana. The city of Aurora reported 141 DUI arrests, with just 8 for marijuana. And the city of Denver reported 157 DUI arrests, and only 1 was for marijuana. So for those Colorado jurisdictions where marijuana is legal, over the span of mid-August to Labor Day weekend summer driving, 13 out of 359 impaired driving arrests were for marijuana. Kevin Sabet's colleague, Dr. Christian Thurstone, is a Denver area rehab owner who owes much of his business to the marijuana smokers forced into rehab by prohibition. He claims that the kids he admits to rehab are now testing at absurd levels of THC that they never reached before legalization. He is purposefully confusing the marijuana metabolites tested in urine with the active THC tested for in blood. The kids who do smoke pot aren't higher than they were before. As this data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health show, for ages 12 to 20, past month and past year pot smoking has fluctuated in Colorado, but remained similar to 2002 levels. Overall, more kids in Colorado haven't tried marijuana, increasing from 63% who've never tried it to 65.6% who've never tried it. These years encompass the rapid expansion of Colorado's medical marijuana system that began in 2009. To conclude, there are a few other non sequiturs Kevin Sabet may offer in support of continuing marijuana prohibition. When we point out how we'd be taking away the marijuana businesses from Mexican cartels, he'll say that marijuana is only a small part of their business and they'll just expand into selling other drugs and committing other crimes. But to whom will they sell other drugs? There are 26 million marijuana users in America, only 2 million cocaine users, only 350,000 heroin users. Mexican cartels can't invent demand. And of course they'll commit other crimes. They're criminals. That's what criminals do. So again, why do we let criminals control our marijuana markets? When faced with the facts that marijuana arrests and imprisonment are horrendously racially biased, Kevin Sabet will accept that stat and attempt to deflect it by saying we could do a better job in pursuing equality in enforcing our drug laws. By arresting more white people, apparently. He'll explain that there's racism all throughout the justice system, and legalizing marijuana won't end that. Right? But it would be a great first start. Kevin Sabet will warn that legalization of marijuana will lead to increased use. Fortunately, we know what increased marijuana usage looks like. Marijuana usage peaked in 1979 when about twice as many young people were using it. While the Iran hostage crisis, inflation, and the energy crisis were on the agenda in 1979, we can't pin those on marijuana use. Kevin will never offer a figure as to how much pot use will increase, because then we could estimate with some accuracy the projected costs and adjust the taxation to match. Furthermore, increased pot use in and of itself is irrelevant without the context of harm. Did harm increase? I posit that if more people are substituting marijuana for the use of alcohol and prescription pills, we could actually see a net reduction in social harms. Kevin Sabet will always focus on the individual users of marijuana and how we can stop incarcerating them and instead search, arrest, and force them into rehab for their own good, at taxpayer expense for some of them. The glaring omission is the harm Oregon faces from unregulated marijuana markets, which will always exist, somewhat enhanced by the decriminalization that reduces the risk of possession for its customers. Only by regulating marijuana commerce can we eliminate most of these drug war harms, strike a blow against the cartels, and raise money for Oregon's tax base rather than buying gold-plated AK-47s for murderous Mexican drug lords. Kevin Sabet likes to portray the American public as being bamboozled by the far-left drug legalization billionaires like George Soros and the Hollywood media elite. The facts are that the people have access to accurate information about marijuana through the internet. They've seen Colorado and Washington legalized without the sky falling, and half of adults under age 50 have tried it themselves and found most of the scaremongering to be lies and distortions. If money and TV time really determined what America thought about marijuana, the $15 billion spent on the drug war ought to be soundly defeating the combined $5 to $10 million budget of all the marijuana legalization organizations combined. Like the opponents of same-sex marriage who claim the next thing you know, people will marry their dogs, opponents of legalizing marijuana like to play the slippery slope that legalizing marijuana will lead to legal cocaine, meth, and heroin. This is a spurious supposition, given that the latest CNN opinion poll showed 55% support for legalization of marijuana, 84% in favor of decriminalization, and 88% in support of medical marijuana, but at the same time only showed 4% support for legalizing cocaine and meth, and just 3% support for the legalization of heroin. The other problem for Kevin Sabet and his people is the use of medical marijuana. He may say something about that here in the state of Oregon. So I'd like to point out.
Well, that pro-marijuana lobby has pushed medical marijuana in terms of the sick and dying. The average medical marijuana user in California is a 32-year-old white male with no history of chronic illness. Yeah. They actually have a history of drug and alcohol abuse.
Nationwide, 1 in 3 18 to 21-year-olds smoke marijuana annually. 1 in 5 smoke marijuana monthly. The median age of a pot smoker is about 27 years old, so half of all pot smokers are younger than that, with the average age being 29. So, if the average medical marijuana user in California is 32 years old, hasn't California's medical system succeeded in making marijuana more for adults only?
In California, of those who are applying for licenses, 90% don't have cancer, don't have MS, don't have any of the things that you and I would associate with needing medical marijuana.
The people faking pain for medical marijuana theme is one that runs through all of Project Sam's rhetoric. The one statistic Kevin Sabet likes to use is that 94% of medical marijuana patients are qualified for pain. This is true, but misleading. Indeed, in Oregon, 51,000 out of 55,000 patients register pain as a qualifying condition, but what Sabet leaves out is that patients can qualify for more than one condition. Do you suppose cancer causes a little bit of pain? In actuality, pain represents just 64% of the conditions being treated with medical marijuana in Oregon. If persons qualifying for their non-pain condition also put down pain, the number of pain-only patients in Oregon could actually be less than half.
When do we have to smoke it in order to get the benefits of the THC? Like, do we call on people to smoke opium in order to get narcotics? That's ridiculous.
It sure is. But marijuana ain't opium. This is another fallacy of false analogy. If morphine, OxyContin, Percocet, Darvocet, and other opioid painkillers didn't exist, you can be sure that we'd support allowing people in enormous pain to smoke opium and not be arrested for it. The side effects from opium smoking are far more harmful than smoking marijuana. Part of this argument is to focus on smoked marijuana when we have so many better ways of preparing marijuana. Also, cannabis is the only controlled substance for which the less potent natural version is scheduled more strictly than its more potent synthetic version. A 15% THC bud of marijuana is Schedule 1 and has no medical value, or Schedule 2 in Oregon, while a 100% THC Marinol pill is Schedule 3 and prescribed by doctors.
Let's make sure people with cancer get the kind of marijuana that's non-smoked that they need. We don't need to legalize smoked marijuana in order to do that.
This is the form of logical fallacy called no true Scotsman. The idea here is that marijuana can't be medicine because it hasn't gone through the standard FDA approval process that determines what we call medicine. If the FDA says it's safe and effective medicine, like Vioxx, for example, then it is. And if they haven't, then it's not. If you point out all the medical benefits of marijuana use, even if you've experienced it yourself, you're wrong, because no true medicine is a raw smoked plant. This is where I like to point out that aspirin has never passed the FDA approval process. It kills hundreds every year, and nobody arrests people who grow willow trees, whether they chew the bark for salicylic acid or not. Thank you for your attention. The people of Oregon are supportive of legislative efforts to end the futile war on marijuana consumers. You can create legalization that is tempered by legislative wisdom and not formed by activist priorities. But through a referral or through an initiative, legalization will happen. That's all we've got for our piece today on debunking Kevin Sabet. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll post that up on YouTube for those of you who'd like to use it for yourself. Also, the presentation itself, the PowerPoint and the PDF of the slides with all of the script will be saved online. I'll have those up in the 420 Radio shop later today. Stay tuned for Hour 2, Toker Talk Radio. We'll talk about the news of the day. I've got a really interesting story here on how the Congress might force Obama to bust the pot shops in Washington and Colorado. This is some scary stuff, folks. We'll also take your calls at 971-533-7111. For everyone here at Rolla J Studios in beautiful Potland, Oregon, I'm Radical Russ. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, take care of each other, Tokers.
This is the Russ Belville Show. The Russ Belville Show is blogging and podcasting daily at radicalruss.com.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it,